Today, we will examine terms like languages, dialects and varieties for understanding relationship between language and society. We have looked at language in details, and on the basis of our understanding of language, we will examine the term dialects. So far, we have also tried to make an attempt to understand varieties and a relationship between language and variety. We will look at these terms afresh in a moment. What we find from our discussions so far on language is the following. Language is an innate human capacity. We have established that in the sense that it's natural and it's normal, unavoidable and automatic capacity. It grows in us. We do not opt to learn a language. We have no choice but to learn language while growing up. The underlying system of language gets unfolded and human mind works on it in a very subconscious way, and the entire process is very subconscious for the cognitive understanding of this capacity. In short, language is an innate human capacity. It is a capacity, it develops in us. It's a fully structured system. It has structure at all levels like sounds, words, sentences and discourse. Each one of these levels are relevant for independent study and understanding, but in the connection of understanding the relationship between language and society, we will be looking at the relationship between sounds, words and sentences together. And this is what we mean when we say language defines human. We do not use language and its part independent of one another. The whole system when becomes external of individual, and in such a case it defines humans. It is used in society and the rules of language use are very systematic as well, in the same sense as we say language is structured. Language happens to be both an individual as well as social entity. Language as a phenomena remains individual as long as we are looking at the individual components, several modules of language like sounds, words, sentences, and when we are looking at the internal development of language and how human mind interacts with such a development and how it functions as a catalyst, how it allows language to grow within and things related to that. Such a thing is part of language which makes it as an individual's phenomena. The moment it becomes out of individual, that is, it becomes articulated. When we, in simplest term, the moment when we speak, it becomes a social entity. And it is important and crucial for us to look at this part to see the distinction between language as a cognitive phenomena, language as a phenomena of human mind, language as a product of human mind, vis-a-vis language as a social phenomena. And in order to understand what we mean by rules of language use, we need to see the distinction between these two things, and the rules of language use become apparent only when we consider language as social entity. Similarly, there are few terms and ideas that we would like to understand for a clearer understanding for the relationship between language and society. we keep using these terms many a times which are relevant for such an understanding. Let us look at the first one, the term grammaticality versus acceptability. A sentence has to be grammatical, and when we say a sentence is grammatical, we primarily refer to the rules of language. However, the acceptability depends on the rules of language use. This is why we can say a sentence is possible out of its social context, but it will remain unacceptable. Let us look at the sentence, a very famous sentence in the understanding of language, used several times: a colorless green idea sleep furiously, or we can say colorless green ideas sleep furiously. What happens in such a sentence is, this sentence does not have its total meaning. This sentence does not mean anything. However, it is totally grammatical. The sentence is grammatically viable, it does not violate any rules of language and comes up as a perfectly grammatical normal sentence. However, this is not acceptable because it is out of the social context. It does not mean anything in the real world. Also, there could be several sentences which will remain out of their context. For example, let us look at 3 sentences in a row. The president is the head of the constitution. Taj Mahal is in Agra, and Washington DC is the capital of the United States. If we say these 3 sentences one after the other, each one of these sentences is grammatical independent of the social context. However, in the social context which makes it a discourse, these sentences remain unacceptable. And here, by unacceptability, we only mean out of discourse, out of social context. We are trying to bring in the idea that acceptability, the idea of acceptability in language is governed by social rules. And we will look at some of the examples of these social rules, in particular the use of second person pronoun, before we want to understand society and identity. And here is what I want you to understand about the rules of language use. See, there are 3 terms for second person pronoun in Hindi. These terms are आप, तुम and तू. They are all you, which is second person pronoun. Now, what I really mean is, we will number them 1, 2 and 3. The use of these 3 is context dependent. Each speakers of Hindi, they know where they need to use aap, where they need to use tum and where they need to use tu. The use of one in a different context would make the whole context unacceptable. So let's look at where they are used. The one aap will be used in the context where we are addressing senior people, elderly people and unknown people. That also contains elements of formality. Whereas the use of tu that is tum, is dependent on familiarity, totally familiar people, and reduced level of formality. Friends, people of the same age group, and so on. However, the third one is used in a total familiar context. So, totally familiar, familiar and formal, that will be the hierarchy in the use of this thing, in the use of the second person pronoun. So, the use of one in the other context will make it unacceptable. And here is an example that I can quote, that I can give you to understand, to make the point clearer. See, this is this number 2, tum, as I mentioned, can also be used for the people of the same group. However, this is not totally, that rule does not apply all the time. You can use the term tum for the people of the same age group when the level of formality is reduced and the group of speakers, that is the speaker and the hearer, are familiar with one another. If the hearer is not familiar and is still from the same group, this will not be used. What comes in is this. So, the formality, the level of formality takes precedence over the use among the same group people, the condition for the use among same group people. At the same time, the term up can also be used for people of younger age group, and again the same condition would apply when the speaker is not familiar with the hearer. So, the level of formality gets precedence and familiarity takes precedence over where this can be used. That is the use of second person pronoun for you in Hindi, where they have 3 different forms. Now, the point is, again, to reiterate, the use of one in the other context will lead to unacceptability, and sometimes there is a hairline distinction between unacceptability and ungrammaticality, but largely unacceptability is governed by the rules of language use, governed by the rules of the social condition, social context. All right. The next part which we want to understand, to look at such things in greater details for further understanding for the relationship, is society. We want to begin with the term society. A society can be a complex idea to define. However, for the purpose of the study of language, we have tried to make it simpler, and the term society can be identified, can be defined as a group. However, the group could be as small as 2 person with no upper limit on the number of participants in the group. So, a group for a particular purpose would define society. So, how does this translate into the context of the study of language and society? When we use the language in the society, we need at least 2 people in the group, and even though there is nothing visibly common between the 2 which form the group, here is what will be common. The 2 people who are interacting with one another, they are interacting for the purpose of interaction. The interaction itself becomes the purpose, and for that, with that in mind, it can still be defined as society for the understanding of the term in the context of the study of language and society. That will be a very micro level definition of society. There are various definitions of society available in the larger domain of the study of sociology, and we will stay away from that for the time being. So, to conclude this, we can say a group drawn together for a purpose is called society. The term identity is also relevant for understanding of language and society. Identity is a linguistic construction of the members in one or more social group or categories. It is not a preconceived idea. The term identity is not like male or female. It is a nuanced way for referencing. So, identities are constructed, identities depend on several parts, and why we want to understand this term is because language happens to be one of the strongest marker for construction of identity. We will be looking at these also in details. Another term which is going to be used several times is speech community, and this is interesting in the context of understanding of society. Individuals who linguistically behave alike speak the same language or the dialect or variety. We are using the three terms at this time without making any distinction between them. So, individuals who behave alike linguistically, and it simply means the individuals who speak alike or who we perceive speaking alike will form speech community, will speak the same language and will form speech community. Again, just like the definition of society, defining speech community is going to be complex. It is already too complex. There are several definitions of a speech community available. We are not going into the details at this point. However, I do invite you to look at any elementary introductory book on speech, on sociolinguistics, to see how the term speech community has been defined. My idea is to generate your interest in these terms so that you develop a better understanding. However, we will be using these terms only to understand several other ideas later. So, the other thing that we can add to the understanding of speech community is also individuals who observe same linguistic norms are also going to be part of this speech community. And what becomes even more interesting is to include the idea in understanding a speech community that individuals may belong to many speech communities at a time, and one individual may be member of many speech communities. And here is how we understand. An individual speaks different types of language. If the individual shares different types of identities, and therefore, the use of language in various different contexts would also constitute a speech communities. So, take for example, somebody speaking Hindi or Tamil, they become the member of Tamil speech community if that individual, if an individual is a Tamil speaker, becomes the member of Tamil speech community. If the individual also speaks English, immediately the same individual becomes the member of the English speaking community as well. If that individual is a student, then the student becomes a member of the speech community which is constituted with the students of the same type. And if the same individual is a singer or a player, then that individual becomes the member of yet another speech community. Therefore, it is possible for an individual to belong to many speech communities, and therefore, for each term like speech community, identity and society, we said it is difficult to define them because there is no one way to look at these terms. We are looking at these terms from the perspective of understanding language and its relationship with society. Here are some of the domains of language use that we would need to keep in mind. So, every time we are going to be using terms like domains of language use or domains of language function, here are the things that we can keep in mind. The family happens to be the primary domain for language use. Friends is yet another domains of language use, and the language used in family is going to be strikingly different from the language used among friends. The use of language in community, the use of language for the purpose of business or among business communities, the use of language in the context of religion, the use of language in the context of government's functioning, media, and finally education. Each one of these, however, the list is not restricted only to these domains. There could be many more such domains of the language use. However, these are few examples where we want to understand the meaning of the domain of language use. Now we come to the term dialect, and we would like to understand the distinction between language and dialect. We would at least begin this discussion and would want to understand this with simplicity at least. The term dialect is, at least to introduce the term and to be fair with the term, is a very socially loaded term. It could also be politically loaded. It means different things. In the context of understanding of language, there is absolutely no distinction between the two terms language and the dialect. Therefore, I am also going to be talking about superficiality of the distinction, with the idea that all natural languages that people speak are acquired in the same manner. I invite you to look at the acquisition of language and the parameters involved in acquisition of language with great details, and then come to an understanding of how language is acquired in details. Once you have finished doing that, you will realize that all the languages are acquired in the same way. All the languages are acquired with the same technicality, with the same parameters. Then how could one be language and the other be dialect? What could be the technical or technically grounded linguistic basis for defining language and dialect? This is the reason when we evaluate the terms language and dialect on the basis of acquisition of language, we come to the conclusion of superficiality in making such a distinction. Now, if you examine what I have just said about dialect so far, then you can hear some contradictions. I am saying both. What I am saying is making an attempt to make a distinction between language and dialect is superficial. However, I am also saying dialect is a socially and politically loaded term. But we need to understand this in the context of the study of language. For the purpose of technical study of language, for the purpose of technical understanding of language, there is no distinction between language and dialect. they are the same thing. And therefore, there is a famous quote which says, a language is a dialect with an army and navy. Both parts of this quote is important. A language is a dialect. What a beautiful way of defining a dialect and making the conclusion emphatic that there is no distinction between a language and a dialect. A language is a dialect. Recall our discussions on language and varieties. We underlined that individuals speak only varieties because language include several varieties within. So, the term dialect or language go all the way to making distinction between languages of individuals, which is also called idiolect. But that will help us understand the term language and dialect, that when we speak different varieties, then what we speak is actually dialect. Therefore, the definition of dialect can only be a language is a dialect. The second part of this quote puts even a stronger point, that when people try to make an attempt to distinguish the two and call one language and the other dialect, it simply means that what people call language, and that's possible, it's possible to call something language compared to something else as dialect only in the presence of army and navy. That is, that army and navy here are used to indicate might and strength. So, what people with power would speak would be considered language, and the language of the underprivileged will or can easily be termed as dialect, and that is the distinction of social and political load on the two terms. However, technically they are all the same. We would like to evaluate these two terms and re-examine the question of variety in the discussions of standard and what we call a standard language. And next time we will look at the notion of a standard language for the understanding of language and society. Thank you.